There are stories that survive because they are told. And then there are stories that survive because they are felt, carried not in headlines, but in the silence between songs, in the texture of a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than performance, somewhere closer to confession. The story of those 3 days in 1970 belongs to the second kind. Not many people were there. Fewer still understood what they were witnessing. And the man at the center of it all never offered an explanation. He simply walked in, stayed for 3 days, and walked out. What he left behind would only begin to make sense much later. And even now, it does not make complete sense. That, perhaps, is exactly as he would have wanted it. To understand those 3 days, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to a stage in Los Angeles, but to a childhood that moved constantly and never settled. To a boy who learned very early that the world does not hold still long enough to be trusted. James Douglas Morrison was born on December 8, 1943, in Melbourne, Florida. His father was a naval officer, a man of precision, discipline, and command. The family moved frequently, following military assignments across the American South, and eventually to the West Coast. There was no single place that became home. Instead, there was motion. And there was reading. Enormous, voracious, restless reading. The young Morrison consumed books the way other children consumed meals. Rimbaud, Nietzsche, Blake, Kerouac, writers who pushed language past its polite boundaries and found something dangerous and luminous on the other side. There was a tension building from very early on, quiet and pressurized, between the life expected of him and the life accumulating inside him. No one around him had any way of seeing how far that tension would eventually carry him. He arrived at UCLA's film school and sat in the back of lecture halls, filling notebooks that belonged to no course. It was in Los Angeles that he met Ray Manzarek, 2 young men on a beach. Morrison with poems he had no music for. Manzarek hearing something in those fragments that another person might have dismissed entirely. The band assembled with inevitability. Robbie Krieger on guitar, John Densmore on drums, Ray Manzarek at the keyboard, building those cathedral organ lines, and Jim Morrison at the microphone. But the real story was never only in the music. From the very beginning, there was a quality to Morrison's stage presence that did not belong to the ordinary category of rock performance. Other singers worked the crowd. Morrison seemed to be doing something else, something interior, more private. He held silences that made audiences uncomfortable, and in that discomfort he found something true. He was not performing in the way the word is usually understood. He was exposing himself to some current of feeling or darkness, and the audience was witnessing that exposure whether they had signed up for it or not. The songs were unlike anything else on American radio in 1967. Light My Fire, People Are Strange, The End. Not love songs, not protest songs. Something stranger, deeply personal but universally resonant. People heard themselves in those songs, not the selves they showed the world, but the ones they kept in the dark. What the audience heard was presence. What he carried was something else entirely. By 1969, the weight of everything had become visible. The Doors were one of the most successful rock bands in America. Jim Morrison was 26 years old, carrying all of that, and something in him was beginning to fracture. Slowly at first, then with an acceleration that caught everyone off guard. Concert appearances became increasingly unpredictable. Studio sessions grew more complicated. Morrison was drinking heavily. He was writing constantly, filling notebook after notebook with poems never intended for albums. Simply the overflow of a mind that could not stop, even when the producing was costing him something he could not name. Then there was Miami. Whatever actually happened on that stage in March 1969, obscured by time, mythology, and legal proceedings. The aftermath altered the Doors irrevocably. Venues canceled. The legal situation dragged for months. Morrison found himself more entangled in the machinery of his own image than ever before. He was no longer just a musician and a poet. He was a case, a symbol, a cautionary tale and a martyr simultaneously, and none of those categories left any room for the actual human being who had started writing poems in UCLA notebooks because he simply could not stop. In the months that followed, he threw himself into the poetry. He published 2 collections, The Lords and The New Creatures, dense with the influence of Rimbaud and Blake, with formal experimentation that showed someone who cared deeply about craft. But underneath the poetry, pressing harder against the walls of everything he was doing, there was a question with no clean answer. Something to do with what it meant to have given everything, really given it, and still feel like the most essential thing remained trapped inside. That is where the 3 days begin. It was the spring of 1970. The Doors were in Los Angeles, working on what would become LA Woman. The sessions were going well, looser, more collaborative, a rawness returning to the band's sound. Morrison seemed present. He seemed focused. And then, one evening, he told the band he needed to use the studio alone. Not for a session, not for the album, just alone. He needed the room, the equipment, the hours. Ray Manzarek remembered the moment. There was something in Morrison's voice, something that did not invite negotiation, something that said, "This is not a request that has alternatives." Manzarek, who had known Morrison longer than anyone, who understood the difference between Morrison performing a state of mind and Morrison actually inside one, heard that quality and said yes. He told the engineer to give Morrison whatever he needed, and he left. Morrison walked into the recording space alone. He had a bottle. He had his notebooks. He had the microphone, the boards, the reels of magnetic tape, and a particular silence that recording studios generate, that heavy, padded, airless quiet designed to hold sound and let nothing escape. For 3 days, almost no one knew exactly what was happening inside. The door was locked. Food was left outside and sometimes taken, sometimes not. The engineer reported hearing Morrison's voice at irregular intervals, sometimes singing, sometimes speaking, sometimes something that existed in the space between song and speech. There were long stretches of silence. There were stretches where the sound built to something the engineer described, years later, as unlike anything he had heard in years of studio work. Not frightening, exactly, but not ordinary. Not the sound of a man recording a track. The sound of a man in conversation with something that was not in the room. Nobody went in. On the morning of the 3rd day, the door opened. Morrison walked out, unshaven, pale, wearing the same clothes, carrying his notebooks. He asked the engineer for coffee. He sat in the anteroom and drank it without speaking. The tapes were on the machine. They were real. Then Morrison did something no one there has ever fully explained. He took the tapes. He labeled them in his own handwriting. He put them in a bag. And he walked out. He did not give them to the band. He did not give them to the label. He did not leave them for anyone else to hear. He took them into the private portion of his life that has never been fully accessible, the portion that exists in the shadows between what is documented and what is simply felt. In the months that followed, the Doors completed LA Woman, by general critical consensus, one of their finest records. Morrison's voice on that album sounds different from his earlier work. There is a depth to it, a resignation that is somehow also a kind of freedom, as if something has been set down or accepted, as if the 3 days in the locked room had served some purpose the album could absorb without naming. He flew to Paris in March 1971. He had spoken for years about stepping away from the machinery, from the celebrity, from the weight of being Jim Morrison in America. He wanted to write. He seemed, to the people who saw him there, to be working toward a quieter version of himself. He was 27 years old. He died on July 3, 1971. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was found in the bathtub of the Paris apartment he shared with Pamela Corson, his companion of years, the person who perhaps knew the difference between his public face and his private one better than anyone. There was no autopsy. What is not speculation is the loss. What is not speculation is the particular silence that opened in American music when the news arrived, the silence that comes when something ongoing simply stops. The Doors did not continue. Ray Manzarek spent the rest of his long life as keeper of the flame, giving interviews, writing memoirs, maintaining the argument that Jim Morrison had been a genuine artist, a poet in the oldest and most serious sense. He was right about that, but there was something Manzarek could not fully explain, something that lived in the gap between what he knew about Morrison and what the 3 days in the locked studio represented. He talked about those days in interviews across the years, always with careful restraint, as if the full weight of what he understood could not be put into words without doing it wrong. The tapes have never surfaced, not officially. There have been rumors, the ordinary mythology that gathers around a figure whose death left questions unanswered. Some claim to have heard fragments. None of it has been confirmed. The 3 days remain in the category of the unknown, not the unknown of scandal, but the unknown of the interior, the portions of a life that resist documentation because they were never intended to be documented. The tapes are somewhere. Where they are gone. Either way, the door was locked, the microphone was on, and Jim Morrison was inside, alone with whatever needed saying. The applause was real. So was the silence that came after.